Newcastle. Yes, Newcastle just absolutely pummeled PSG 4-1 in the Champions League. But how could this possibly have happened? What did PSG do to get it really horribly wrong? Did Newcastle just outplay them? Was it a mixture of the two? Or were PSG just absolutely petrified of Jason Tindall asking them all for selfies? We're going to look at all the little factors that happened in this video, looking at the tactics and a few little themes that went across the game that impacted on this result. But first, we're going to have a little look at the teams, starting with Newcastle. So Newcastle set up in a similar system to what we've seen throughout other parts of this season. In this 4-3-3, Dan Burn at left back, obviously, who had a fantastic game. And Lascelles coming in for Botman, who also Lascelles had a fantastic game considering he's barely played at all this season. So Newcastle's 4-3-3 here, in possession, very much looked like a 4-3-3. Tonali and Longstaff would get forward, make these midfield runs. Isak would get forward and Gordon and Almiron would often invert. Trippier kind of remained very much further back compared to Dan Burn, who'd really help Gordon on this left-hand side and try and isolate Hakimi, who was definitely PSG's kind of main outlet to try and get out from the back. But their main asset that they had was their man-to-man press. So here's PSG with the ball, and we'll kind of show the man-to-man press here that we had going on. So Newcastle would very much sit in this 4-5-1, with Isak kind of pressing either centre-back. And Gordon was really integral to this because he would make these out-to-win runs, that would force Marquinhos to go into the other areas, pass the ball away from Hakimi. Tonali would really help here also because Gordon would cover these passing lanes and Tonali would help to move out here to cover any sort of gaps that Gordon would leave. And it really highlighted the strength of Newcastle's press to force them really high and to force them into playing balls into the channels where Newcastle were very superior, particularly Dan Burn, who just headed absolutely everything that came his way. Dembele really only had a couple of chances, one of which we'll look at in a minute, but they really struggled to progress the ball at any point really through the centre of the pitch, had to hit it along into the channels, and Newcastle really did dominate that area. In possession, Newcastle moved the ball really quickly to expose that kind of lack of support here in PSG's midfield because they set up in that 4-2-4. So Guimaraes really often had a free pass straight through the midfield line of PSG through Ugarte and Zaire-Emery when they just won the ball back. And that was something that they kept on highlighting throughout the game. Newcastle were also very happy to leave Cher and Lascelles up against Ramos and Mbappe, and they pretty much dominated. They'd follow them all the way in. Lascelles very often would be right up against Mbappe whenever he had the ball, so he really never had the chance to turn and run at Lascelles. And we'll show that a little bit later in the fact that Mbappe did not even complete one single successful dribble throughout the whole 90 minutes. This is one of the most elite players in the game, and Jamal Lascelles just completely blocked him out. So we spoke about Newcastle's pressing structure and how it worked really well in this game, and this is a perfect example. Highlights both the weaknesses of PSG and how Newcastle just completely exposed them in their pressing. So here you can see we're 2 minutes 20 in. 2 minutes 20. Marquinhos has the ball here. He has a few options. He can either pass it across the Skriniar to his left, play it into Ugarte and try and progress the ball, or there is a long ball off to Colomwani on the left. Marquinhos decides just to kind of roll the ball back with his studs, kind of Brighton style, to kind of bait the press forwards. And what happens is he plays the ball into Hakimi, receives the ball back, and Newcastle are already kind of closing down these options. So Ugarte isn't really free anymore because Isak, Guimaraes, Longstaff are all really tight and close to him. There really is no chance of him doing that. So Marquinhos takes this ball back from Hakimi here and passes it back to Skriniar, who then proceeds to pass it back to Donnarumma. Skriniar passes it back to Marquinhos, and the ball goes back into Donnarumma. Now Donnarumma now doesn't really have many free options. Admittedly, he could pass it in here into Skriniar, but he's already being closed down by Almiron. Guimaraes is touched tight to Ugarte as he was throughout most of the game. Gordon's closed this gap in between him and Hakimi, and Isak is curving his run to try and stop this pass coming out here to Marquinhos. So if we just get rid of all of this, and then what happens is Donnarumma plays the ball back in here into Marquinhos. Gordon chases Marquinhos down into the corner, tackles him and admittedly gives away a goal kick, but then celebrates. And this really highlighted how Newcastle just utilised the crowd from the minute go. They utilised the atmosphere they created. PSG looked really off it when it happened, and the press was kind of the main galvanising force behind the Newcastle atmosphere that they created. This particular mistake very much highlights the ongoing mistakes that happen for PSG, and pretty much exactly the same thing happens about 5 minutes later when Newcastle score their first goal. So this is the setup that happens for Marquinhos' mistake for Newcastle's first goal. So you can see here Gordon's again curved his run here, curved his run here to force Marquinhos to play inside. Tonali's covered Gordon across here, as we pointed out earlier with the tactics. He's covered Gordon and covered Hakimi. So that means that passing lane is also closed. So there really is no obvious option right now for Marquinhos, and he kind of panics at this point. So he could play the ball into either of the pivots, but they're also being really touch-tight pressed by both Longstaff and Guimaraes. So Marquinhos could play this ball back into Donnarumma, but he also picks out Colomwani here. Now, as we move on to the next one, you can see Lascelles is out just outside the screenshot, but very much aware of the situation that's going on here. So he closes down that ball. Every other option that Marquinhos has is pretty much closed. So he tries to dink the ball into Colomwani, makes an error, it goes into one of the midfielders' heads, bounces back into Isak, has a shot, rebound, Almiron, and PSG are 1-0 down. And this very much comes from the lack of confidence that PSG had in their structured play, but also how Newcastle really did kind of exacerbate that lack of confidence by pressing them really high, making them make mistakes, and using that atmosphere to really put PSG under pressure really early on, get 1-0 up, and it kind of, the same thing happened throughout the rest of the game. It very much set the tone. Now, from a PSG perspective, this isn't to say that these tactics wouldn't work, but because they did create a good chance very early on in the game, but then they seem to just get completely knocked off their game and lose confidence. And this very much highlighted in this first chance, the only real chance that PSG create across most of the game apart from the goal. So the ball here starts with Skriniar, and you can see that Newcastle is still very much touch tight. You know, all these players are very much man-to-man marking. Skriniar has the ball here, plays it out to the left to Lucas Hernandez. Now, Lucas has options here because Zaire Emery has slightly backed off the back of Guimaraes. So the ball gets played into Zaire Emery, who turns here, and then the ball gets played forward into Colomwani and Mbappe, and then PSG are very much on the transition. And they really did not create very many chances where they were able to be on this similar transition. So the ball comes out here to Mbappe. He gets to the edge of the box and plays a really nice ball across here into Dembele, who really should score. Well, not necessarily score, but has a really good chance to score because Dan Burn here is occupied by Gonzalo Ramos. These are the similar opportunities that PSG really should create in these transitional moments that they never really had the chance to, because they just look so uncomfortable playing out from the back, apart from in this one little situation, and then they just went back to just not doing this whatsoever. So it kind of shows that the 4-2-4 wasn't necessarily the wrong idea. They just looked really uncomfortable and really lacking in any sort of confidence to undertake it, apart from in this one little scenario that they never really recreated. I think this game also kind of highlighted how PSG miss a player like Verratti. Obviously, he left in the summer to go to Qatar, and he really gave PSG control in possession and solidity in defence that the midfield really does miss and did miss throughout this game. Ugarte is not particularly press resistant in comparison to Verratti, looked quite shaky in certain scenarios, and PSG really lacked that kind of structural soundness that he really supplies. But when we look at Newcastle, and we have to give praise to Newcastle here, they really did take their chances that they had, and they created good ones. They had an XG of 0.94 compared to PSG's 0.93, and Newcastle had very little of the possession, but had by far and away the most shots in target, 8 compared to PSG's 2, and they really did work their goals well. Admittedly, a couple were from mistakes, and the last one was an absolute screamer from Cher, who slips and somehow scores a belter while he's halfway onto the floor. But I think it really highlights in the third goal here how they're really exposing PSG's kind of unfamiliarity with the tactics that they were playing. So here, this is basically the setup for the third goal. Newcastle on the transition. Trippier has the ball here. PSG are quite set in their 4-2-4. Obviously, the strikers are not really tracking back too well. But there's no obvious gaps, apart from the one that Sean Longstaff exposes, which he makes the run through to here. And you'd argue that here Isak has, there are two defenders to Isak, so Skriniar really should be taking control, and arguably should be a little bit further over here when he sees Longstaff make that run. And admittedly, he does get close, and Sean Longstaff creates a good opportunity for him to score, but Donnarumma really should not be conceding here. He gets a full hand to it. He should at least be parrying the ball out into an area where Marquinhos can clear it. And this was kind of a running theme throughout the game, was PSG's kind of lack of focus and confidence on the ball, and kind of their mental instability throughout the whole team. Very much highlighted in this second goal, which we can see here. So it comes in from a Trippier free kick. Lucas Hernandez here on the marking Dan Burn is basically on the floor, trying to rugby tackle him for some reason. The ball comes in, kind of pings about a little bit, may or may not come off Jamal Lascelles' hand, but it doesn't look intentional to me. But then it comes across to the left-hand side, and Hakimi is here, as you can see, highlighted here, just gesturing towards the referee, not even concentrating as to what's going on, saying about a handball. Not entirely sure why he's not playing to the whistle. It's one of those things that you get told when you're like 4. Here, Lucas Hernandez is still on the floor, like 5 seconds after Dan Burns put him down after he tried to rugby tackle him. And admittedly, Guimaraes here shoots when first time he probably should play across and Newcastle should score earlier. But then PSG don't really react to what's going on. So it gets saved and it comes back out to Guimaraes. Lucas Hernandez is here. He's back up off the floor, thank God. But he's not goal side of his man. Skriniar isn't touch tight to Dan Burn. Not entirely sure where he is. And Zaire Emery, okay, it's not too bad from his perspective. But this ball comes into the back post. And Skriniar decides just not to jump. He tries to back into Dan Burn. Doesn't work at all. And Dan Burn stoops over him and scores. And it kind of just shows that the lack of general concentration in this team, how they're making just quite basic errors from a set piece. And this really just should not happen from a team of elite quality with elite players like PSG have. Now, Newcastle worked really hard to keep Mbappe under wraps, and he very much was throughout the whole of this game. Never really made any sort of indent on the game. Apart from that one chance that we saw earlier that he created for Dembele, there really weren't very many opportunities where he had to run in behind at the Newcastle defence. That was largely because of Newcastle's mid-block and the inability for PSG to play through that, through the double pivot. But it kind of particularly is shown in this graph that you see here that Mbappe made very few successful passes throughout the game, and a lot of them are going backwards. So he never really had the chance to turn and run at PSG. He didn't have a single successful take on or single successful dribble throughout the whole 90 minutes that he played. He only made 2 key passes, and they were crosses into the box, one of them being Dembele's. And it just, even with 2 strikers that were ahead of him, there were very few opportunities that he had to play those kind of positive balls into the box. And even when he did, the 2 PSG strikers, Ramos and Koulibaly, never even got on the end of it. But overall, you really got to give Newcastle credit. They worked fantastically hard. The credit goes to Eddie Howe for his tactics and the press that he's instilled in this team, and getting the performances out of players like Longstaff, Lascelles, Jacob Murphy, Dan Burn, all players who at points have looked like championship players, but have really turned them into world-beaters under his tutelage. And their press was immaculate. They pressed really well. They forced the PSG players into mistakes. Admittedly, they really all did look off their game, but they capitalised on those mistakes, and that was so important. They also, at every situation, even really early in the game, as we saw with Anthony Gordon when he tackled Marquinhos at the very start, they celebrated, make sure they got the crowd on their feet, build that atmosphere, players jeering the crowd on all the time, made sure that PSG were as intimidated as they possibly could. And they just were the better team on the night. And now they go into the back-to-back games against Dortmund in control and at the top of the group. And who would have thought that at the start of when you saw the draws coming out, at the start of the campaign for the Champions League? Never would have imagined at this point that Newcastle would be top of the league, beating PSG at home. It's kind of crazy when you look at it and how well Eddie Howe and his team have done so far this season. But as for little old PSG, they really did struggle throughout all of the game. They didn't really create any big chances apart from the one goal they did score. And the one chance we saw earlier with Dembele. They really struggled to progress the ball, and they really didn't make use of the space between Newcastle's midfield and defence that really could have used a third man in midfield to kind of take advantage of that. And they looked like a team who hadn't played 2 in the midfield, which they haven't, and were really uncomfortable with the general instructions they were given. Ugarte really struggled to kind of get his foot on the ball and progress the ball. Not particularly press resistant, and he could have really done with the third man in midfield. And I feel like it wasn't that Luis Enrique got his tactics wrong. It just felt like they really needed that third man from the start. It could have worked with the 4-2-4, 4 players up against Newcastle defence, but it didn't really work, and they didn't expose the centre-backs, Lascelles in particular, who has barely played. Mbappe, world beater against Jamal Lascelles, didn't pull him out of position very much, didn't isolate him, and never really created chances, as we saw from Mbappe, to take him on, dribble past him and kind of create these chances. And for a man like Mbappe, Newcastle just completely, just marked him out of the game. Didn't have a chance at all to kind of make his mark on it. They were generally outworked and looked like they kind of expected to go to Newcastle and get a result, and were generally taken aback by them going down so early and the pressure they were put under. Particularly Marquinhos just looked really... I've never seen Marquinhos like that before. He looked very sheepish, very kind of lacking confidence with the ball at his feet for, a world-class defender who's been at the top of his game for a long time for PSG. I've never really seen him like that before. And throughout the game, they just never looked a threat. And I just think it really is credit to Newcastle for creating the scenarios that put PSG under that pressure. But PSG never really rose to the occasion and never really turned up. But yeah, Newcastle just pummeled PSG. It's slightly mind-boggling. Who thought we'd have been here at the start of the season? But yeah, if you enjoyed my little breakdown here, then let me know in the comments. Subscribe if you'd like to. And yeah, hope to see you in the next one.